Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Intermediate LC subject headings. This session serves as the last in our two-part series on Library of Congress subject headings. I'm Erin Elzy, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Bobby Bothmann from Minnesota State University, Mankato, where he is the Metadata and Emerging Technologies Librarian. Bobby catalogs books and e-resources, wrangles files of MARC records, and investigates new technologies. He is a member of OLAC and serves on the editorial board for CCQ. He holds an MLIS and an MS in Geography and English Technical Communication. He also teaches cataloging and classification as an adjunct instructor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bobby brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have him with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Bobby, please type them into the question box on your screen. Bobby's slides are numbered, so if you are referring to a specific slide, please include the slide number in your question. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here's Bobby. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
All right, good morning, everybody. So welcome. Again, Intermediate Library of Congress subject headings. And there we go. Again, my name's Bobby Bothmann. I'm from, there we go. I am from Minnesota State University, Mankato, and coming to you from Las Vegas today, where this is a brief pause on my spring break tour of fun stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. And some of the things that we went over, if you weren't here last week, this will be new, but most of this will be review. Some conventions, just some abbreviations that we will see throughout the slide presentations and that you see used in reference to LCSH anyway. BT means broader term, NT for narrower term, FFS is an abbreviation for free floating subdivisions, LC for Library of Congress, and LCSH for Library of Congress subject headings. NAF for the name authority file, SH is short for subject heading manual, and then also SHM, the subject headings manual. So the subject headings manual is this instruction sheet, collection of instruction sheets on how to create and use LCSH terms. So our tools for today, first off, the full set of the LCSH vocabulary, all of the topical terms, all of the free-floating subdivisions and such are available as PDF files at this link here, the first link that you see under Library of Congress subject headings. And then if you subscribe to Classification Web, which is a tool that the Library of Congress supplies, you have access to all of those resources from that tool itself, and it also includes the name authority file as part of Classification Web. So everything you need is all right together there. If you do not have Class Web, then you can use the LC authorities that you can find at this address here. And the LC authorities has, again, all of the topical headings from LCSH, but it does not necessarily have all of the free-floating subdivisions, and a few other things are not in there. Here is a link to the Library of Congress Subject Headings Manual. Again, SHM is the abbreviation that we use for it, and it is the instruction manual for how you create LCSH terminology and how you make use of it, how you apply it. Library of Congress genre form headings, so we'll talk a little bit today about genre form headings more than we did last week, and there is a nice page here that you can follow. The Library of Congress has been going through the LCSH vocabulary and identifying terms that are or may be used as form and genre headings and adding them to a thesaurus that is called the LCGTF, the Library of Congress Genre Form Terms Thesaurus. And then finally, we also have the Van der Broughton Essential Library of Congress Subject Headings book that if you don't have it, it's a really good thing for you to get a hold of. So our learning outcomes today, we will learn a little more about constructing structured headings with the use of free-floating subdivisions. You'll be able to select and apply name headings as subject headings, apply appropriate headings for works about literature and works that are literature, and apply appropriate genre terms. So let's talk a little more about related headings. So if you remember from last week, we were looking at decision making, and one of the terms that we saw beneath that main term was this RT field, RT for related term, and it had one or two terms in there for related terminology, so something that is similar to but is not a broader or narrower term of what we are looking at. So related headings are things to really take note of. And when you see a related heading, it really is worth going to that related heading and looking at its broader terms and what its related headings are, because its related headings may not be the same as what you're seeing in the particular one that you found that from. So definitely worth following that, just because you may find something better if you do that. So when we're talking about related headings, one of the things to keep in mind with that is sometimes you have this bit of parallel going on with them. So if you've got something that can represent 2 or 3 topics using one topical term, then you want to do that with one topical term. And the example that is given in the subject headings manual is single parents. So when you look at single parents, it has related term single mothers and a related term single fathers. So when you have a book that is about single mothers and single fathers, you don't do 2 subject headings, one for single mothers and one for single fathers. You use the one single parents that encompasses both of them. Another thing to keep in mind, again, is that you cannot use a broader and narrower term most of the time together in the same record. So about that narrower term or it's about that broader term. If it's mostly about the broader term, and then there is significant attention paid to some particular narrower term for these topics that are hierarchical in that manner, then you may use that narrower term, but just be very careful with that. Pattern headings. So pattern headings are this really great, amazing tool that is included in LCSH itself. The idea here is that by choosing certain topical terms to act as a pattern, you can show all of the various free-floating subdivisions that can be used with that particular term, and it is representative of other terms that are like it. So for any animal on the planet that you need to classify using LCSH, if you go to fishes or cattle and look at those, you will see underneath that all of the applicable free-floating subject terms that can be used with any type of animal. And so I think the reason we have 2 here, one for fishes and one for cattle, is that fishes represents something that, a type of animal that lays eggs, and cattle, a type of animal that bears live young. So among other differences, and I think that's the main reason why. So take a look at both of those when you're classifying something that is an animal. In the subject headings manual, the worksheet H1146 lists all of the different pattern headings that are there, and they do it by subject field and then category. So for example, we see here social sciences. In the social sciences, if you have a topic that is about an industry and you want to see what the pattern is to make use of for different free-floating subdivisions that would go with a topical term that represents an industry, then you can look up either construction industry or retail trade, and you'll see all of those together. So if we look at cattle, for example, so this is coming out of the PDF, so what the print would look like. So we see cattle up here at the top, and then we have the M dash here, or 2 M dashes depending on how deep we're going to go. So this is cattle aging, this is cattle aging prevention. So that's how you read these things. So if you have 2 M dashes here, you have to look up at what is indented to the left above it, and then up and what is indented to the left above it. So that's how that scheme works here. And so you see in this list, and this list goes on for about 3 pages, I think, of all of the different free-floating subdivisions that may be used with a topical term that is a type of animal. So very handy for getting ideas to see what you can use to classify your particular resource. Now let's talk a little bit about the first subject heading. So one of the questions that I often get from students when I'm teaching this is, don't the mark tags need to be in order, and aren't the subfields supposed to be alphabetical? And one of the hardest things is to make sure that we don't look at those mark tags as numbers, and that we don't look at those subfield identifiers as letters or numbers. So they're not necessarily going to be in alphabetical or numerical order. Your first subject heading is meant to be the one that is most encompassing of the topic, most representative. And when we're doing biographies, when we're dealing with biographies, the name heading should be the very first subject heading that you use. So when you have a biography of a person, you would go to the name authority file and find their access point, and you will use that in the 600 field. That will be the first subject heading, not because it's 600, rather because it's a biography about that person, and so that person is the most encompassing of that content. Then immediately following that access point for the name, you should have a class of person heading. So class of person heading is any topical term that represents a person as to either their profession or their ethnicity or whatever it is about them that identifies them in that particular context of that biography. And then for anything that is cross-disciplinary, where you have 2 or more subject headings and they're co-equal, you just end up having to pick one. So you have that power. You have to decide which one it's going to be. And what I like to do when I think about that, choosing those, what makes it easiest for me is to take each of them and then identify what the LC classification number should be for those particular topical terms, and then just do a shelf list on that and see where it would be sitting, and think about the serendipitous search. Would the user be more excited to see it on the 1 or on the other of those particular terms. So if you think about it that way, which shelf does this book really want to be with? Because if we think about that book and the shelf as a click, the book wants to be with its click, so think about it that way. And again, that first subject heading, that's the basis for how you determine what your Library of Congress or Dewey Decimal classification number should be. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about geographic names and subdivisions. So we have direct versus indirect order when we're dealing with the geographic free-floating subdivisions and when we're dealing with geographic names as a topical term. So when a geographic name is a topic, when it's about that particular place, then we want to put that geographic name into a 651 field. That means that the content is generally about that particular place. And the order of the name, the style of the name, is what we call direct order. So, for example, right now I am in Las Vegas, Nevada. That's direct order. That's the common usage. That's how we think about it. So that's how we would enter these names. Of course, you still need to look them up in the name authority file and see what the preferred form of the name of that location actually is. So the town where I actually live is called Good Thunder. It's in Minnesota, and right now what we are doing is we use the state name or the province name or the country name, depending upon what we're dealing with, as the qualifier. So that's why we have Minnesota with the English abbreviation in the parentheses. You may also notice here that it is abbreviated, and so this is something that may change at some point in the future. NACO has been talking about, and SACO as well, have been talking about eventually at some point we may change these abbreviated place names to fully spelled out names to be more in line with the functional requirements of authority data and bibliographic records and such, so the functional requirements family of theoretical models. Counties are going to be listed like this, so Blue Earth County or Decatur County or whatever county it might be, and again qualified by the state or province. And this holds true for most of our Anglo countries. So you're going to see this for the United Kingdom, for Canada, and a few other places as well. Once you get outside of Anglo countries, we just do the place name, the city, followed by the country in parentheses. So Berlin, Germany. So this is all direct order. When we use a geographic name as a subdivision, however, as a free-floating subdivision, then we have what we call indirect order. With indirect order, you take the higher political subdivision and it is followed by the narrower one. So you can only have up to field Z's following a topical term. So this is that indirect order. So we've got Minnesota first and then Mankato, Minnesota first and then Blue Earth County. So when you think about this in terms of, again, an alphabetical list, such as when you're looking in a dictionary, then Healthcare Minnesota would come first, followed by Healthcare Minnesota Albert Lee, so something that starts with A, Healthcare Minnesota Blue Earth, Healthcare Minnesota Blue Earth County. So this allows for a nice alphabetical arrangement when you're looking at a topical list. Okay, give Just 1 second here. The way that you know what the direct order is versus the indirect order is when you look in the name authority file, look up that place name, and look at the MARC view of that particular authority record. And the preferred heading is always going to be in a 1XX field because this is a geographic location. Geographic locations in the authority file go in a 151 field. So that's why we see the preferred heading in a 151. And a little tip for you with that is that when you take this 151 field and put it into a geographic field, into a bibliographic record, all you really need to do is change that 1 to a 6, or if you're dealing with a personal name and you're doing an access point, you can change it to a 7 or a 1, depending on what the function is. So you'll know what the bibliographic one will be, except for that first number, which you'll need to usually change. So this is your direct order, and this is how you would use it in a topical heading in a 651 subfield A. If you want to use the geographic location as a free-floating subdivision after a topical term that has may subdivide geographically on it, then what you need to do is look at the 781 field, and that will provide the indirect order, the proper indirect order for that particular location. So you don't ever have to struggle with how should it look. You would go to the authority record, because that's what the authority record is about, is establishing how all of these things should look. So go to the authority record, and that 781 field shows you what your indirect order should be. This is particularly important when we're dealing with things like Washington or New York, where we have, for example, with New York, because of the state name and because of the city name, we will often use qualifiers to differentiate them. And this happens as well with Washington because there are so many counties and the state and the place and such. So always go and check this out, the 781 field, so that you know how to make use of it. Okay. Next slide here. All right. So let's talk about countries and regions and first order political subdivisions. So this took me, I admit this took me a while, a couple of years long ago, to really figure out what we were talking about when people were throwing around this first order political subdivision term. It didn't quite make that much sense to me. So hopefully I can explain this so that it is truly meaningful for you. A country is, so we're just going to go through some basic definitions and set the scenario for all of this. A country is any geopolitical area with recognized boundaries that is a sovereign nation. So within the United States, we have Indian nations that are sovereign nations. The Apache tribe of Oklahoma, for example, is a geopolitical area. It is a country. Canada is a country. Japan is a country. So these things are all countries. And then each country is something that can be divided into what we call political subdivisions. So if we take the United States as a country, the political subdivisions in this country are the states and the counties and then the cities, right? So, or townships and then cities. So those are the different types of political subdivisions. The first order subdivision, first order political subdivision, is a state. It's first order because it is the highest political subdivision before the country itself. So that's what we're talking about when we say first order political subdivisions. And so when we think about, in terms of the Anglo world in particular, the United Kingdom, which in LCSH we call Great Britain rather than United Kingdom. And that is mainly because it would be super expensive to change Great Britain into United Kingdom, I think, is the main reason that we are still doing that, using that older term. There's also other meanings with Great Britain and the United Kingdom itself, but the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, is the country, and then its first-order political subdivisions are England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, etc. So those are the equivalent in the United States of the 50 states and then its territories. So those, all the 50 states, Washington, D.C., the territories like Puerto Rico, those are all what we call first-order political subdivisions. We also have this concept of regions, and those are things that are either bigger than a country, like a continent, so Europe, or smaller than a country but bigger than first subdivision. So New England is a type of region within the United States. So this is what we're talking about with first-order political subdivisions. And it's important because when we're dealing with free-floating subdivisions, with the geographic free-floating subdivisions, that when you use them, it is either about the country as a whole, or it's about one or more of those first-order political subdivisions. And you cannot use, when this type of structure happens, you cannot use the country in conjunction with a first-order political subdivision. So, for example, down here at the bottom, you could never have sheep shearing United States, Minnesota. You just can't do that. It's either about the United States or it's about Minnesota sheep shearing. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, from last week we talked about this, but I want to hit on it again because it's an important concept. So sheep farming allows for geographic subdivision, and this is why we can have Scotland coming after sheep farming. The free-floating subdivision management, however, does not allow for geographic subdivision, and that's why it has to follow the geographic term itself. So when you have a topical free-floating subdivision and you want to make use of and are allowed to make use of a geographical free-floating subdivision, the geographic term has to follow the last term that allows geographic subdivisions. So, and this is that slide explaining that, sorry. Our topical term comes first, and then your topical free-floating subdivision is normally what will happen. Then if you can subdivide something by a geographical place, that geographical free-floating subdivision goes, and again it has to follow the last topical term that allows for subdivisions like that. So ecology is our example here, and we can see in LCSH that it allows for geographic subdivisions. Study and teaching is a topical free-floating subdivision term, and it also allows for geographic subdivisions, and that's why we have ecology first, followed by study and teaching, and finally Minnesota. And again, the explanation that I had a little bit earlier, the sheep farming allows for subdivisions. Management does not. It has nothing following. It doesn't say no. It doesn't say yes. It says absolutely nothing. And when it says absolutely nothing, that's the same as saying no. and therefore sheep farming will come first, and then we have our geographic subdivision, and then we have our topical free-floating subdivision. So let's talk a little bit about names as subjects. So when we use a name as a subject, we've usually got a biographical work. It's not always the case. There are times where you may have a work that is about a person, but it's not necessarily wholly biographical. It may be about specific people in some way. So when that is the case, like this book here, Georgia O'Keeffe, A Life by Roxana Robinson, this is a biography, and our first subject heading has to be Georgia O'Keeffe. So we go to the name authority file, we look up O'Keeffe, and we find that the preferred form of her name is O'Keeffe, Georgia, 1887 to 1986. So that's the example that we have here. In our other book here, we've got FDR and Stalin and Churchill and Truman. So it's not a biography per se, but it is about these four men with relation to this particular topic. And so in the subject analysis for this book, we will want to have a personal name subject heading in a 600 field for each of these people. And so here I've got just two, for example purposes, Roosevelt and then Stalin. So go to the name authority file, look them up, and then enter their name in a 600 field exactly as you find it for that preferred heading in the name authority file. Then we have the biography form free-floating subdivision, and it's used on biographical works. So when you use it, you give that name of the person first, and then you follow it with that class of person term. So Georgia O'Keeffe was a painter, right? So painter is a class of person. Painter is like an occupation, is an example here. And so we can use either painters or we could use women painters. And once you have that topical term for the class of person down following their name heading, then you append to it that subfield V biography as we see here. So this is really all the subject analysis that we need for this biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. Then let's look at Queen Latifah. So for Queen Latifah, who has a multifaceted career, what we have to do is select the heading that best represents that person's career. So again, it's all about what the content is. So if this is just about Queen Latifah as a singer, then really the only subject heading class of person terms we're looking at that we're interested in are rap musicians and jazz singers. But if this is a more comprehensive biography, this is about all of the different multifaceted aspects of her career. She's a rap musician, a jazz singer, she's an actress, a talk show host, and she runs her own company, so she is a CEO. So we've got all of these different LCSH terms here in the box that we can use as class of person terms that relate to Queen Latifah. So one of the things that the subject has is that if we can reduce it to a single term, then we can and should do that. So rap musicians, jazz singers, and actresses, all of those have a broader term of artists. And so we would go to artists. Now, personally, I would argue that this is not as useful for the patron, not as useful for the user. So for a user who wants to see a biography about a jazz singer, then maybe finding Queen Latifah in there would be a useful thing. So having some of those more specific terms in the subject analysis would be more useful. That's my personal opinion. So let's talk a little bit about subject analysis for nonfiction works. If you've got access to ClassWeb and you go into the search LC subject headings and use the keyword searching and use in literature as your keyword search, you will see that there are tons and tons of terms in the vocabulary. There's like over 3,800 of them is what I was able to figure out. So you will see things like abandoned children in literature, abjection in literature, bread in literature. I mean, bread, that's kind of fun. So there are lots of fun terms that are in there for different concepts that have been used as themes or symbolism or whatnot in literature. So we would use this type of topical term for nonfiction works that are talking about this concept as it has been used in literature, in fiction. So if you have a book about, if you have a fiction book about bread, then it's going to be bread subfield V fiction because it's a fictional work about bread. You would never use bread in literature because that is not fiction. But if you have a novel where the person is talking in that novel about bread in literature, then bread in literature subfield V fiction would be an appropriate type of thing. So hopefully that makes some sense there. So take a look at those. Those are really good for use for nonfiction works about literature. We've also got literary form, so American literature, for example, history and criticism. So that's a very common type of subject heading that you will see. You can also use an individual person, so it's usually an author. It is not for biographical content. So if you have a book that is a criticism and interpretation of a specific author, then you would look up their name, authority heading, and use that in a 600 field and append to that this criticism and interpretation. So this is more common analysis. Less common are where you have the subfield X characters or subfield T with a work title followed by subfield X characters. And you can actually add after the word characters for this last one with the work title, you can add yet another subfield X for a specific character. So if, as we all know, with FRAD, functional requirements for authority data, it allows us to treat fictional characters as authors, and we would create their name headings now the same way we would do for an actual real human being. Under AACR2, it was done as a subject term so that they were in 650 fields. So you are going to see differences in how these are applied. So things that were created before our switch to RDA are going to be a little different looking and won't follow necessarily the style that we're using with RDA itself. At any rate, let's say that there is no actual subject heading for a particular fictional character. You have a book that is talking about that fictional character. You can use a 600 field for the author of that work, a subfield T for the title of that work, and then subfield X characters, and you can follow that with subfield X character, and you would do it last name, comma, first name. If they don't have a last name, it would just be their first name. So some ways that you can do that if the name of that particular character doesn't exist. And the rule is that that character has to appear in at least 3 published works before we would create an authority record to represent that particular character. All right, summarization of the content. So at 710 RDA, this is the attribute for the work and expression where we create a summary of the content. And it is particularly helpful to do a brief objective summary of the plot for works of fiction. It's helpful for you because you can then use that to choose terms for your subject analysis. So here I have, this is probably a little too long still, but a summary for the novel Lord Fowl's Bane by Stephen R. Donaldson. And you can see the highlighted terms in here are the keywords I picked to look up in LCSH to do subject analysis for that particular novel. So in the subject headings manual at H1790, that is where you will find information about doing subject analysis for fiction. And the Library of Congress has very specific guidelines on when they do and when they do not do subject analysis for fiction. Non-LC libraries, we can do whatever we choose to do. And so we don't necessarily have to follow this particular policy where they only do subject analysis for biographical and historical fiction and animal stories. So those are the only types of fictional works for which they do subject analysis. You may do more. And I think there is some research and evidence out there that suggests that doing this is more helpful for users as well. So your summarization is a really good source for selecting topics to look up in LCSH for your subject analysis. Again, your subject analysis should be based on the plot, not what type of literature it is. So if you have a science fiction story, you can't use science fiction as the subject heading because it's not about science fiction. It is science fiction, and you want to use science fiction as a genre term. What you want is to find topical terms that relate to the plot. So here for Lord Fowl's Bane, we have leprosy patients, fiction, mind and reality, fiction, so that kind of covers the delusion part, and redemption, fiction for that savior part. And again, we can add character names as subjects. So Thomas Covenant's fictitious character, you can see it's a 650 field. That's because it was created during AACR2 days and has not been changed over to conform with RDA. Harry Potter, however, has been changed to conform with RDA, and that's why Harry Potter is in a 600 field. We can also use imaginary places. So we have Oz imaginary place. Again, 650, it was created even before AACR2. When it gets converted to RDA, it should be a 651. So genre terms go into the 655 field. These are terms that identify the type of category, whether it's adventure, biography, poetry, graphic novels, science fiction, romance, etc. And they can come from LCSH or they can come from the genre form list. If they exist in the genre form list, use that before LCSH. So LCSH has been mined for these. It's an ongoing project where these terms are being added to the genre form list itself. When you use the genre form list as your source, the second indicator of the 655 should be a 7, and then in subfield 2 we use this LCG FT to identify that particular vocabulary. Okay, and we have come to the end of our session here, and we've got a good 15 minutes to answer questions or to clarify anything that you might want me to repeat again.
All right, Bobby, thank you. That was really great. And just a quick apology, I think we did have a few audio problems, but it did seem that all the information came through okay, so hopefully everyone was able to hear what they needed. And a reminder, if you have not done so, now is the time to please type your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar dashboard. Our first one was, our viewer was wondering if you could review when it's okay to include both broad terms and narrow terms.
Yes. So the the way that it is explained, and I don't remember which subject heading manual sheet it is, but it's the one that talks about the narrower terms and broader terms. The way that it is explained is that if the narrower term can be used with a broader term if the content of the book is primarily about the broader term as a whole, but significant attention is specifically given to a narrower term, and it meets that 20% rule that we talked about last week. So at least 20% of that novel, not that novel, 20% of that content is about that narrower topic. Then you would go ahead and include a subject heading for that narrower topic.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, how necessary is the subfield V, specifically in differentiating between juvenile materials and adult? For example, when cataloging a children's book about George Washington, do you need to add a subfield V to his 600 heading?
Yes. So if you have a nonfiction work, any nonfiction, let me back up. For juvenile materials in general, if it is nonfiction, it should have subfield V, juvenile literature, following every subject heading, every LCSH subject heading that is in that particular record. If it is a work of fiction and it is juvenile, it should have subfield V, juvenile fiction. That's when you're using LCSH vocabulary, so your second indicator will be 0. If you are following and including the children's subject headings, the CSH, then your second indicator will be 1. That means that you are providing subject analysis using the rules and conventions for the children's subject headings, so it is by definition already juvenile. So for nonfiction works, there would only be subfield V's for the specific type of form that might be there, whether it's humor or graphic novels or whatnot, bibliography, biography, those you would use. And then for works of fiction, it would be subfield V, fiction. Again, this is for the children's subject headings usage. So yes, you do want to have those. I suppose if you only have juvenile materials in your collection, you could opt not to use them because there would be no confusion for your users. But when you have a collection that includes both general resources and juvenile resources, those juvenile resources should have juvenile next to them. Otherwise, you're going to mislead your users.
All right, thank you. Our next one is, how would one know if a 655 second indicator of 0 genre heading or an LCSH genre heading is authorized? Would it be part of the authority file as a genre?
So the way that this works is let me step back a second with this one. The Library of Congress has not really used the 655 field for genre headings historically that much, particularly when it comes to fiction. And so when you see particularly older records, you will find if there is any subject analysis, it will say like American literature or French poetry or whatever it might be, and it will be in a 650 field. And there are a lot of places, particularly academic institutions who have large collections of literature and large collections of works about literature where that becomes problematic. So you want your records that are talking about literature to have 650 fields that say this is about this particular literature, and you don't want your works that are literature to have 650 fields that have that literature name. It's about that literature, and that's not the case. So this is part, I think, of, if I remember right, this is part of why the Library of Congress began this project in 2011 to identify terms in LCSH that can be used as genre terms and to put them into this genre form thesaurus. So, having said that, any term that you find in LCSH that could be used as a genre, you may use that in a 655 field. The 0 in the second indicator, all that is telling us is that it came from that particular vocabulary. So it's fine to use it in a 655 field, something from LCSH. The fact that it's coming from that 1XX field in the authority record of that particular term in LCSH, that makes it authorized. So that's the case right there. If you find it in LCSH and it works as a genre term, then you can use it in a 655 field. But you should check the genre form term first to see if you can find a term there before you would go to LCSH. And you don't have to use LCSH. You can use any thesaurus out there, any vocabulary that works.
All right, thank you. Our next one is about geographical subdivisions. Is it correct to say that country names and state names will not appear in the same subject string?
Yes, a country name and a state name cannot appear in the same subject string because the only places where we would have both would be where we use the first order political subdivisions, which is the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, and there's 2 other countries, I believe, and I can't remember what they are. So there's only 4 or 5 countries where that is the case. Otherwise, like if you had something about a particular state in another country, then that might be a little different. Like a department in France, it's probably subfield Z France followed by subfield Z in the name of that department would be my guess. It's been a long time since I've seen one, but the other countries generally are not as, we generally don't have that level of detail, that atomistic detail for non-Anglo countries.
All right, and the next one is for fictitious characters. If LC hasn't created an authority record for the character, but a library wants to add a fictitious character to their record, should they use a 650 or a 600?
Okay, so this is, part of this is if today, and you were following RDA rules, which we should be following RDA rules regardless of what we're using when we are creating anything that would be a name authority, because the whole name authority is, regardless of what you do, is RDA. So if you need to create one that doesn't exist, do it through NACO if you can, so that it gets established. It will be a 600 field for a person, whether it is a fictitious human or a fictitious character like Kermit the Frog or Miss Piggy. So you can look those up in the authority file and see how they're done. So any fictitious character would be a 600 field. If you are not a NACO member and you want to do that, then my best advice would be is to follow RDA principles when creating that particular subject heading, but instead of using a second indicator 0, use a second indicator 4, or use a second indicator 7 with the subfield 2 of local. They both mean the same thing. They both mean local.
All right, thank you. Our next one is, does Australia use first-order political subdivisions?
Australia does not, weirdly. They, so like you would use subfield Z for the indirect, it would be subfield Z Australia, subfield Z Brisbane, and then in parentheses QLD for Queensland.
Okay. Then we have a reference to slide 18. Can you give an example for a 600 person name, subfield X work title, subfield X character?
Yes. So I guess, let's see. Well, we can use anything. So let's say that we want to talk about the character Thomas Covenant, and let's presume that as a subject or in the authority file, then we would have the 600 for Stephen R. Donaldson here, so his access point. We would have the work title to which that character, what we're talking about here, so that title might be Lord Fowler's Bane, subfield X characters, and then another subfield X, Covenant, Thomas.
All right, and then we have one last question. We do only have a couple minutes for this answer, and it might be a long one though. Is how do you feel that Ferber library reference models, agents, and persons will affect the future of name headings in the context of how they are encoded in MARC?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't know. I've read a bit. I saw the presentation about the LRM at IFLA, but I think part of it has to do, I think there's more about aligning it structurally and with terminology, and I think it will have, I think it's more terminology related, how we're naming things, and I really don't know very much about how it's going to affect how we construct access points or how we identify attributes of different agents. So I'm not very familiar with what's going to happen with that yet.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bobby. That was really, really great and informative. We are really happy that all of our attendees could be with us today, and you all will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions, as your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. Thanks again to our presenter, Bobby Bothmann, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Mary Aycock and Wanda Jazzieri, and to Megan Doherty from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. We have 4 more webinars scheduled for this season, including one next week on cataloging, gender, and RDA Rule 9.7. See the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. We have the next forum coming up on March 28th on Advances in Electronic Resources Management. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you again all for joining us today, and this will conclude our session.